I'm going to stand up slowly so you can move the camera, right? Okay, good. So what I'd like to do is spend the next 3/4 of an hour with you presenting the argument from Black Earth. So Black Earth is a history of the Holocaust, and it's a traditional history in the sense that it does recount the events from 1933 to 1945, but its particular emphasis or its particular valence is its emphasis on explanation. So where I began the book was from the observation, which others might contest, that Holocaust studies had moved into a memorial mode without ever having achieved satisfactory explanation, and that the memorial mode was taking up the space that would have been needed for explanatory work, and that in particular the memorial mode allowed us, perhaps ironically, to fall back into national modes of discussing the Holocaust, because when one discusses memory, one invariably discusses a national memory, and almost always one's national memory. There is data to back up these assertions. So the last time I looked, which was a couple of years ago, well over 90% of the conferences devoted to the Holocaust were not devoted to the Holocaust, but they were devoted to the memory of the Holocaust, which is a quite different subject. And for me, it always poses, memory in general poses what I think of as the genitive question, which is probably a slightly perverse way of putting it, having to do with having studied too many languages, which is memory of what? And do we have the of what? So this book is an interpretive book. It's a book which makes arguments, but at the same time, it makes these arguments very much on the basis of primary sources, in particular Jewish primary sources. Because for me, another irony of what had happened to the Holocaust is that it had become enclosed in German history and in German sources, which of course are indispensable, but which cannot by their nature capture the perspective of the victims, since 97% of the victims of the Holocaust did not know the German language. There is a sort of myth which says those sources are lost. In the context of the Holocaust, people use the word lost, and then it sounds pathetic, and we're supposed to then understand that something terrible has happened to them. But in fact, the reverse is true. It's remarkable how many sources we do have in Russian, Yiddish, Polish, and in the other languages which Jews spoke at the time. It's remarkable how much effort Jews themselves went to create sources at the time. And it's also remarkable how many initiatives there were during and immediately after the war to preserve those sources, which for me is a reason to begin from them. So what I'd like to do here is present the two arguments of the book, the two unfamiliar causal arguments of the book, beginning from things that Jews actually said about their predicament. So the way the argument in Black Earth works, and I'm presenting it now in a very schematic way, is that adding to or complementing the traditional argument from ideology, which I accept in a certain form, I add to ideology an ideology of what I think of as global anti-Semitism, the factor of ecological panic, and the factor of the state. And rather than running through how the book works, I'm going to present each of these arguments beginning from the point of view of a Jewish survivor, or in some cases not a survivor. So let me begin with ecology. With ecology, a couple of sources that struck me particularly were, one, a Jewish revisionist Zionist, a man called Feldschuh, who was one of the leaders of the Ghetto Uprising of 1943 on the right wing side, who, in referring to the Jewish ghetto and the destruction of the Jewish ghetto, left these poignant words: "People lived under the earth," which struck me as an interesting way of putting that situation. People were living in basements in northeastern Warsaw, the territory which had been defined as the ghetto, and they had turned those basements into bunkers in many cases, and from those bunkers they were trying to hold off Germans who very quickly moved to the tactic of flame-throwing the bunkers to drive people out and then shooting them when they came out. But Feldschuh's comment had this interesting ecological air to it. We were living under the earth. Or to take an example which is more famous, the Hungarian Jewish poet Radnóti, who was a forced laborer at the end of the war, and in anticipation of his own death, kept poetry, which he wrote poetry his whole life. He was a poet. That's what you do if you're a poet. And he kept it in a small book, which he kept in his left breast pocket. And on the outside of the booklet, in I think 8 languages, maybe 6, he left instructions saying, "When my body is found, please make sure that these poems are published." So he was in fact murdered close to the end of the war. His body was in fact buried in a pit. It was in fact found, and here's one line from one of the poems, or a few lines in English. "I the root was once the flower, under these dim tons my bower, comes the shearing of the thread, death saw wailing overhead." Now, I mean, many things are striking about this. One is the ability of people to compose poetry in these conditions, right? I mean, for me, the whole idea that there is no poetry after Auschwitz is itself a barbarism, because it denies the capacity of people to be civilized in precisely these barbaric conditions. There's that. There's also the reminder of how so many people, in both of these quotations, of how so many people actually died in the Holocaust. That is to say, the first, and in my opinion, the decisive killing technology of the Holocaust was shooting people at close range. The death factories of Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Chełmno, Auschwitz come online later, and they kill about the same number of people, maybe slightly more. But it's the murder by bullets at close range which begins the process, and this is for me the decisive thing, which instructs Germans that this kind of thing is possible. It's long before the gas chambers are online that the discussion about a new form of final solution, that is killing people where they live, has begun. So, but the thing that I want to draw on is the way that at the end of his life, this Hungarian poet, this Jewish poet, is associating himself again with the earth. And what I want to try to draw from this poem is the intuition that maybe he has it right. That I mean, I could multiply these examples of the way that Jews would talk about the earth, and I want to move from the intuition that perhaps there's something in the sources that we have missed or not taken seriously enough. I think the thing that we have missed is the ecological construction, or the ecological description that one can put on the Holocaust. So if we now move back a couple of decades in time and shift from the minds of these Jews who were dying towards the end of the Holocaust towards the mind that was most important to its conception and execution, to Adolf Hitler and in Mein Kampf, it's very striking how at the very beginning of Mein Kampf, Hitler begins from an ecological description. Now, I should be really clear. I get into more trouble with this in Germany than in the English-speaking world, but it's a little bit unclear everywhere. By ecological, I don't mean in the sense of you recycle and that's a good thing. By ecological, I mean in the sense of looking at life in terms of your relationship to the biological world. That's what I mean by ecological. I mean in a neutral sense. So Hitler begins from what I would call his ecology. His ecology, which is presented in the first few pages of Mein Kampf, says that all that there is on the planet is resources. That's the only meaningful thing. The meaningful resource is land. The reason why land is a meaningful resource is that we extract food from land. He moves on to this. His second observation is that humans are essentially like animals. Human races, he says, are essentially like human species. The way that human life exists is, or should exist, is by way of competition, which involves the stronger surviving, the stronger races starving the weaker races. That would be a good thing, right? The closest thing that Hitler comes to an idea of the good is that we actually do away with all our ideas of the good and revert to a competition in which some of us starve other people. Now, there are two important implications about this for ethics, which I think maybe sometimes get a little bit of short shrift. The first thing is that from this comes the nature of Hitler's anti-Semitism, which is a very radical form, I think probably the most radical possible form of anti-Semitism, because what Hitler's idea is that we might believe that there are things in the world besides a competition to starve. We might believe that. We might believe that there are reasons to show mercy or express solidarity or spare others. If we believe any of those things, for any reason, be it Christian mercy, be it human solidarity, be it working class solidarity, be it a legal contract, be it a constitutional regime, be it the rule of law, if we believe that there should be solidarity or reciprocity or mercy for any reason, that means that our brains have been taken over by Jews. That's where Hitler's anti-Semitism begins. The Jews have the special capacity, according to Hitler, of importing into our minds things that ought not to be there. Our minds ought to function in an essentially bestial mode. These ideas that allow us to recognize anyone beyond our own race, as Hitler sees race, beyond our race as human, if we're able to do that, that's precisely evidence of Jewish presence in the world and therefore in our minds. And the conclusion he draws is that the only way to get the Jews out of our minds is to get them off the face of the planet. And when that happens, the earth and we on the earth revert back to the proper ecology, because there will no longer be any source of what he sees as these perversions. A second implication, which is often overlooked, I think, has to do with science. There are passages in Mein Kampf which are perhaps understandably overlooked about the hybridization of grain, about irrigation, and about pesticides. Now you might think, well, why should we be reading Hitler on pesticides? The reason is that Hitler's view about science is not, I think, what it's usually made out to be, and certainly not what we might think if we read Horkheimer and Adorno and go for that whole Enlightenment story. Hitler's argument is that, sure, there are these technologies, but they can't possibly save us from the necessity of endless competition for limited resources. And if you think that they can, says Hitler, then you have fallen for a Jewish swindle. So the idea that science is a universal, right, as opposed to a particular, is for Hitler one more Jewish lie. It's not that Hitler doesn't believe in science. He believes that Germans will have better science than other people, just like they'll have better states, or better hygiene, or better armies. It's not that he doesn't believe in science. It's that he thinks that science is one more particularity. If you think that science can save us all and thereby prevents or removes the need for a particular struggle of race against race, then, says Hitler, you've fallen for a Jewish swindle. So Hitler thinks that that science would be one more illusion that prevents us from falling into the struggle that we might otherwise, that we should be falling into. Okay, so where will this struggle take place? Now this idea, now we move from ecology to geopolitics, or ecology to what Hitler calls Lebensraum, or from ecology to history. Hitler looks at the world and says, maritime empires are no longer possible. But we know that land empires are possible. We know that frontier empires are possible because the United States of America has shown us how it's done. So with the help of slave labor, you can conquer a continent and exterminate the native peoples. This is the lesson that Hitler draws from the United States of America. He looks upon Americans as being chiefly Scandinavians and Germans, and he sees this as the kind of thing that Scandinavians and Germans can do, and bemoans the fact that he concludes that some of the best Scandinavians and Germans have been lost, and they've shown that they're the best precisely because of what they were able to do on the North American continent. I should say North America because Canada is included in this as well, not just the U.S. So, so this means that Hitler looks at the U.S. as a model for what can be done in Eurasia. Starting from Germany, you can push east and create a frontier empire in which Germans will achieve Lebensraum. Now, this Lebensraum business is also very important because it means a couple of things, and it means a couple of things together, which are politically significant. The combination is very significant. On the one hand, Lebensraum, as I'm sure everyone knows, is an analogy taken from a Darwinian struggle, right? That every species has its own ecological, we would say, niche, right? Biotope. Like every species has its own place. That's called Lebensraum. The German race, because it's like a species, needs to have its own space. That space should be bigger, right? And if you think about it that way, Lebensraum means literally a struggle for survival. It's a struggle for the physical resources that your group needs to survive. But There's also a second meaning of Lebensraum, which also refers back to the United States, and which is more apparent in the second book than in the first. It's easy to remember the title of Hitler's second book because it's Hitler's second book. So in the second, and you know the title of his first one, so now you've got it. In the second book, more than the first, he emphasizes that what he means by Lebensraum, and even what he means by struggle, is not necessarily the struggle for physical survival, but the struggle not to have a lower standard of living than anyone else. And here again, he refers to America and talks about how German housewives, when they're thinking about how they live, are not thinking, do we have enough calories? They're thinking, are we doing as well as the Americans? And then he says something which sounds very much from like French theory of the 60s or 70s. He says, thanks to modern technology, such as the radio, it's no longer our own personal experience which sets our expectations for life. It's what we imagine that others have. And what follows from this is that Lebensraum, in addition to meaning physical survival, also means lifestyle, right? It means living as well as everybody else, or slightly better. And here again, America is the marker, as it were, both objectively and subjectively. America is what you can't fall behind. You have to do as well as the Americans, because the Americans are the ones who most clearly have the future. So, and so you see how this works together politically, because on the one hand, you can arouse emotions having to do with survival, while what people are really fighting for is the good bedeckte Tisch, right? You can arouse these emotions which are very violent, even though in some sense what's really going on is that you're struggling for standard of living. And people can disguise for themselves the fact that it's about standard of living by imagining this is about survival. I would submit that's a form of politics, or a form of thinking about the world and its economic organization, which is not entirely foreign to the way we live now. All right, so in practice, what Hitler thinks is that the territory that's going to be conquered is the territory of Ukraine. Ukraine is the black earth of the title of the book. Ukraine is the most fertile soil in Europe, and so the notion is that if we can physically conquer this territory, this is what's going to change Germany qualitatively. This is what's going to allow Lebensraum actually to be conquered and to be realized. And the important thing about this as a war aim, I'm just going to make this point very simply because it's so crucial to the history of the Holocaust. If it's not for this war aim, the Holocaust would not have been possible, because the war aim to get German force into Ukraine is what makes it the case that German force is where Jews live. There aren't that many Jews in Germany. There aren't that many Jews in France and other places where Hitler fought his incidental wars. It was in the East where Jews actually lived. There are more Jews in individual Polish cities than there are in Germany, right? There are more Jews in individual Polish cities than there were in Palestine at the time. This is where Jews actually lived, in the former Pale of Settlement, in the Western Soviet Union and the Republic of Poland, also in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, in Lithuania in considerable numbers. And so the war aim of going east is one of the necessary conditions of the Holocaust. Without the idea of Lebensraum and without its specific geography, there could not have been a Holocaust, because there wouldn't have been a reason to fight the war there. There's also, of course, the reason why Hitler thinks the war is winnable, which is that, remember, Jews are responsible for all ideas of reciprocity, not only communism, but including communism. And within this worldview, the Soviet Union is a Jewish state run by Jews, where Jews exploit the Slavs. And Jews, of course, only compete mentally, right? For Hitler, this is what's perverted about the Jews. They compete mentally by putting ideas in our minds, but they won't compete physically. So the moment that you begin an actual war, you're breaking through their illusions, and their state, as he sees it, the Soviet Union, will immediately collapse. The Slavs, no matter how bad you treat them, are going to be grateful, because you're going to be liberating them from Jewish rule, and their bounty will automatically become yours. Hence the very unrealistic expectations about what was going to happen when Germany and its allies invade the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. And then, of course, and now I'm following a very strong tradition in German historiography, which begins with Christian Gerlach, and which has been refined, I think, to a point which I think will be hard to surpass by Christoph Diekmann in his book about his two magnificent volumes about Germany and Lithuania. From that point, the war really does start to become something like a war for subsistence. It matters a great deal when the Soviet Union doesn't fall and when it doesn't yield bounty, which it never does. The Germans get more food from Belgium than they do from Ukraine. So it matters when the war doesn't go the way they expect, when the Soviet Union doesn't collapse in 10 weeks. It matters a great deal then that the German soldiers are ordered in the middle of September to feed themselves from the land. This puts other people in a worse position. It matters a great deal that for anti-Semitic reasons, Jews are at the bottom of the list of those who are to receive food, which means it becomes plausible, not just in Poznan later on, but in Lithuania very early, to say it would make more sense to kill these people than to let them starve over the course of the winter. In other words, the ecological vision of how the world is supposed to work, in some sense, comes closer to describing the way the world actually is once the Germans invade the Soviet Union. And this logic is not the only logic, of course, but it is nevertheless an important logic. I'll give you just a few more examples. One telling one, which all German specialists will know, is the decision to liquidate the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942. The calculation that Himmler makes is that we are getting less from working Jews than we would get from the food that we need to feed them. In other words, the calories are worth more than the Jews. Now, before you think, well, that's just an economic calculation, I want to put in your mind the idea that that's just an economic calculation is a horrifying thought. Because if it's just an economic calculation, that means we've already accepted that the life of the people in question is not part of the calculation at all, which was the case. Once you decide that the people in question are going to be removed from the earth one way or the other, then it is just an economic calculation. Then you just think, is their labor worth more than the calories we're giving them? And if the answer is no at a certain point, you kill them. And that's the ratchet upon which the killing proceeds. When the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising happens in the spring of 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in which this man Feldschuh takes part, another little just detail. When Warsaw Jews are drawn to the Umschlagplatz, at the beginning, the posters that are put up in the ghetto say, "Come to the Umschlagplatz, there's bread and marmalade." And you would think, looking at it from our comfortable point of view, how could they possibly have believed that or fallen for that? And the answer, of course, is that if you drive people to desperation by way of hunger, if you can create a condition which really is a struggle for survival, then people will be drawn by the promise of bread and marmalade, even if they have every reason to think that it's false. That's what that world is like. So that's the summer of 42. Spring of 1943. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising takes place. This man Feldschuh is taking part on the revisionist side. Then there's also a coalition of left-wing and center parties who are fighting. The German police commander who's meant to put it down is a man called Jürgen Stroop. When Stroop is asked later in prison what he was thinking about when his men were applying those flamethrowers to those bunkers, when Feldschuh was saying we were living in the earth, what was Stroop thinking about? By Stroop's account, he was thinking of the milk and honey of Ukraine. The milk and honey of Ukraine. In other words, at a time when we would put all the emphasis, and completely understandably, on exactly what was happening to Warsaw and its Jews, the destruction of the largest Jewish city in Europe, the destruction of the Jews of that city, the destruction of the city itself. But what Stroop is thinking about is precisely this ecology. He's thinking about Ukraine. In his mind, the rationalization for what's happening here is that vision there. Still, this is 1943 of that frontier empire. Okay, so that's ecology. Now let's take a moment and think about the state, and then we can discuss. For the state, I'm going to tell you a different story of a different Jew. It takes a bit longer. It's not poetry; it's prose. Her name is Irena Lipschitz, and she is a young woman, a Polish-speaking Jew from Warsaw, whose fate in the Holocaust, at least till the very last thing we're going to talk about, is extremely typical and therefore revealing. So she lives in Warsaw. We're going back to 1939 now. So she lives in Warsaw, which is the most important Jewish city in Europe. When Germany invades on the 1st of September 1939, she does what about 250,000 Jews in Poland do, which is she flees to the east. what these people think they're doing is they think they're fleeing to Eastern Poland. And they go and they're received by local Jewish communities. People try to find places for them on couches or in attics. And then on September 17th, the Soviet Union invades Poland from the other side, which makes of this 250,000 or so Jews people who are now under Soviet power as the Soviet Union joins its German ally in invading Poland. So Irena is in this little tiny place called Wysock, which is close to the Polesian marshes. She's working. She makes new friends. They try to look out for her. That's what she's doing in June of 1941 when the Germans displace the Soviets. And here we have something which is tricky, but is very important to remember, which is when Germany invades the Soviet Union, what is it actually invading, or where does the invasion start? It doesn't start with the borders of the Soviet Union in 1939, it starts with the borders of the Soviet Union in 1941, which means it starts with territories which until very recently had been Poland, or a little bit further north had been the Baltic states. The Baltic states are only destroyed in 1940, so we're looking at the invasion, the German invasion happens roughly a year after the Soviet occupation and annexation of the Baltic states. So the Germans come in June of 1941. In September of 1942, Irena is with the local Jews as they are being rounded up and taken to pits to be shot by, it seems like, a few Germans and a larger group of locals, which is completely typical of the time and place. Irena runs. She runs into the marshes, and she tries to survive by eating berries and by eating mushrooms. But she's a city girl. This is not the kind of thing which is going to last for very long. She decides that what she's going to do is stand out on a road, put out her hand, and ask someone for help. So that's what she does. She goes out to a track, she puts out her hand, she sees someone over the horizon, he gets closer. It's one man, and he's carrying a double-barreled shotgun over his shoulder. She asks him for help. Now, the thing about this story, which may seem colorful, is that it includes all of the basic elements of how the Holocaust happened, or at least how the Holocaust started. Irena represents the largest group of Jews who were killed in the Holocaust, Polish Jews. She is literally physically in the place where the Holocaust starts, the Polesian marshes, which is where Himmler gives an order in July of 1941 for the Waffen-SS for the first time to kill women and children, which is as good a moment as any to date the beginning of the Holocaust. The weapon that she sees is the weapon which kills almost all of the Jews who die in the Holocaust in 1941, and roughly half of them for the rest of the Holocaust. These things are all completely normal, but what we don't see in this picture are things that we might expect to see. Like, we don't see nations, for one thing. Irena is a Polish-speaking Jew who's befriended by Yiddish-speaking Jews in a part of the world where people speak dialects which you can say are Belarusian if you're Belarusian, you can say are Ukrainian if you're Ukrainian. It's also famously the part of the world where the Polish census, the last one taken, identified a very high number of people who refer to themselves as tutejsi, or they would have said tuteshni, from here. Right? That's what the Polesian marshes were. They were famously the place where nationality was least developed. So it's very hard to find nations, which is important for us because when we do the Holocaust, we do it with nations. We do a German nation, we do a Jewish nation, and then sometimes we might toss in another nation, right? There might be the Holocaust in France, and then we ask about the French, or the Holocaust in Bohemia. We ask about the Czechs. We count on that. We fall back on that. We fall back on national paradigms, and I would suggest we also fall back very heavily on national stereotypes, which brings me to the Germans. There aren't any Germans in this picture either. At least they're not physically present at the moment where the story ends. And certainly what we don't have is we don't have some kind of bureaucratic machine, right? We don't have something which is taking her papers or classifying her or moving her through this cycle, which in different ways Hannah Arendt or Zygmunt Bauman describe, where you're first dehumanized and then you're concentrated and then finally you're killed. That's not happening here, as it did not in general happen in the Holocaust as a whole. So we're far away from some of our images, but we're very close to the typical experience of a Jew in the Holocaust, and we're very close to a couple of other things which I think are very interesting. One thing is we're very close to Hitler's fantasy in pages 1 and 2 of Mein Kampf about what the world is like. This Jew is quite literally trying to survive by scratching mushrooms and berries out of the forest. This is what Hitler thought should be happening, right? This is what Hitler expected. And we're also close to something else, which is the consensus of scholarship on how genocide happens, So if we take a step away from the Holocaust and take a step away from history and look at what the social scientists have been doing with the concepts of ethnic cleansing and genocide for the last 25 years, the consensus, and there have now been not just studies, but studies of studies on this, the consensus is that genocide and ethnic cleansing take place in conditions of state failure, of civil war, of political chaos, political dysfunction. That the strong association is not authoritarian state kills its people. The strong association is rather states fall apart, and that creates the condition for genocide. And consider where we are. We're in a place where the Polish state was destroyed by the Soviet state, and then the Soviet state was destroyed by the German state in the course of about 2 years. In that sense, it's typical. Now, when confronted with social scientific generalizations that are backed by huge amounts of data and a generation of consideration, historians generally have a response, and historical response, the response of colleagues, is to say, I know one counterexample, right? That's what, and this is interesting, because historians do know counterexamples. We know examples of places where there was mass killing where the state didn't fall apart. Cambodia, People's Republic of China, the Soviet Union. But what's interesting about those examples, those historical examples, is that in all three cases, you're dealing with a very specific kind of state. You're dealing with a party state, where the main relationship between the individual and the polity was not through citizenship, but which was through a party which was meant to manage history and which could declare states of emergency. Now, why am I dwelling on that? Because if we look at if we bracket the Holocaust for just a moment and we consider those two other trends of trying to explain mass killing, we actually see, I think, what was in fact unique about Nazi Germany. What was unique about Nazi Germany from a scholarly point of view is that it brings together both of the major scholarly traditions of explaining mass killing. On the one hand, Germany was a state that destroyed other states, and it was in the realm where Germany destroyed other states that the Holocaust took place. On the other hand, Germany was a party state, and the ideology of that party was precisely that zones of anarchy should be created where racial struggle will happen. So Nazi Germany is special, but it's special not in a way which has to throw us away from all the things we think we understand about mass killing, but rather in a way which confirms both of the major arguments about mass killing and in fact brings them together. So the way that I would understand the traditional narration of the Nazi rise to power, which I will just assume the landmarks are familiar to you. Hitler takes power in 1933. There are Nuremberg laws. There's Aryanization. There's the creation of concentration camps. The way that I would understand all of that is not as the thing in itself, because that does not cause the Holocaust. Nor, in my view, could it have caused the Holocaust. I mean, for the very simple reason that there aren't very many Jews in Germany, but making the test a little bit higher, that apparatus doesn't kill the Jews of Germany. It gets many of them to flee, but it doesn't kill Jews in Germany, not until it goes abroad, creates stateless zones, and then sends those German Jews to Riga, or to Minsk, or to Łódź, or to other places where the German army and SS has already wiped the slate, as they like to put it, clean, right? So that story from 33 to 39 cannot be the thing in and of itself. I think it has to be understood in a different way. That story of 33 to 39 is the creation of the potential to destroy other states. That's what that is. What is the SS? The SS in the 30s are the guards in the concentration camps. What's a concentration camp? Ask an American lawyer. A concentration camp is a place where the law does not apply. That's what a concentration camp is. And that's why the SS are the guards, because statelessness is their line of work. When the SS become de facto in charge of the occupation in the East, what that means is, not metaphorically now, this is like one big concentration camp. Germany does not acknowledge that the Polish state exists. Germany does not acknowledge that the Polish state has ever existed. Germany applies to Poland the law that European empires, if law is the right word, traditionally apply to colonies, which is to say, this is not a state whose existence we recognize. This is an unknown territory inhabited by unclassified peoples. and therefore we may do as we wish. This is very significant. In practice, when the Germans come into Poland, they don't declare an occupation zone. They start by calling it the general government of occupied Poland, then very quickly correct themselves, because occupation implies that you're occupying something, and their own doctrine was that there was nothing there to be occupied, hence the odd term general government stands alone. And then in the lower level, what they do is they immediately declare the Polish Civil Code null and void. They declare that Polish property rights don't apply, which of course then sets off the chain of events that you would expect in the Polish countryside. If you take Jews, because they have no civil rights, I'm going to emphasize this, into ghettos, and then no one has any property rights, what's going to happen to their property? And are people going to want those Jews to come back? Those questions are very easy to answer. So what I think the best way to understand 33 to 39 is as a accumulation of potential, of ideological but also of destructive potential to destroy other states. And then if we run through the history of the Holocaust, we see how this confirms as German power goes beyond Germany. So individual things like Anschluss or Munich, which usually fall into the category of national history and are not generally attended to, at least at great length in the history of the Holocaust, take on new significance, because Anschluss no longer becomes an Austrian trauma or an Austrian moment of joy or an Austrian thing to consider. Anschluss becomes the moment when all Austrians lose citizenship. That's what Anschluss means, right? Anschluss is the moment where Austria, for a moment in March of 38, ceases to exist. Everything floats free. It's a laboratory where you find out how people behave when all of a sudden Jewish citizens stop being Jewish citizens of Austria because there is no Austria. The symbolic politics, which we all know, the Jews scrubbing the streets, mean this. The Jews aren't just scrubbing the streets to be humiliated. That's how we think about it because because we're semiotic. But they're actually scrubbing from the streets something with deep political meaning. They're scrubbing the word Österreich from the streets, because there was going to be a referendum about the continuation of the Austrian state. When a Jew scrubs Österreich from the streets, the Jew is being associated with the now defunct Austrian state, right? And now that the Austrian state is defunct, the Jew is going to be defunct as well. The same argument then escalates as the Germans destroy other states. What happens in Czechoslovakia? Why are the Slovak Jews the first ones sent to Auschwitz in large numbers? Because if you destroy the Czechoslovak state, as Germany does in March 1939, there is a moment when all of the citizens float free. You then can write a new constitution in which Jews are second-class citizens and don't have property rights. When they have no property rights, very soon for the Slovak government, you can say, why do we have all these immiserated Jews? Shouldn't we be sending them somewhere? And then you can negotiate with the Germans to send them to Auschwitz, which is why the Jews are the first ones to go, the Jews from Slovakia are the first ones to go in large numbers to Auschwitz. As Jews, there are other people there already. They're the first large Jewish group to go to Auschwitz. Or, to be more obscure, why are the Jews of the extreme east of Czechoslovakia the first ones to be shot in the first major mass killing in the Holocaust at Kamianets-Podilsky in August of 1941? For the same reason. The extreme east of Czechoslovakia is given to Hungary. The Jews on that territory are not made second-class citizens. In general, they're allowed to float free without citizenship at all. Then, when Germany invades the Soviet Union in 1941, the Hungarian government takes advantage of the opportunity and expels these stateless, quote-unquote, refugees into the Soviet Union in the path of the Germans. These people who do not have citizenship at all because their state has been destroyed are then rounded up at Kamianets-Podilsky along with local Jews at the end of August 1941, and they're shot. Roughly 23,600 Jews are shot. So the statelessness, the destruction of Czechoslovakia leads integrally to this, and this was the first massacre, not only in the Holocaust, but in the history of the world, on this scale by shooting. So this is a turning point. This showed what could be done. So as we move through the story of the Germans destroying states, we're also moving through the story of the escalation of the Holocaust. I've already talked about Poland. So what I'll say about Poland is that it's very striking that destroying Poland means that you can put Jews in ghettos, but even there you can't kill them in large numbers until Germany invades the Soviet Union. Once Germany invades the Soviet Union, it learns that it can shoot Jews in stateless zones close to where they live. And then the question arises, again, what do we do with these Jews in the ghettos? And that's when we get to Himmler in 1942. I'm also going to say, but only briefly because I don't want to take all the time, that the statelessness is not just some abstraction, right? The statelessness is a change in politics which affects how people live everyday lives. I've given the example of property rights. I'll give another example, which is double collaboration. When the Soviets invade the Baltic states or take and occupy, annex the Baltic states in 1940, there is very large-scale local collaboration. The nature of Soviet rule is that you involve a very large percentage of the population. When the Germans invade the Baltic states, when they invade what had become the Soviet Baltic republics in 1941, they elicit massive collaboration precisely from people who had worn uniforms under Soviet rule. Why? Why? I mean, if you were in that situation, the explanation is obvious. The only way that you can, as it were, prove that you weren't a collaborator with the first regime is to collaborate with the second. And this very nice, simple bit of human nature in dark times is understood by the invaders themselves. So the Germans or their Latvian and Lithuanian language speaking collaborators actually say, if you have collaborated with the Soviets, you can undo it by killing Jews. And I don't say that as an excuse, I say it as a description of a certain kind of politics, which is only present when the state is destroyed, or in this case, destroyed twice. I think it's telling, and we can talk about it more, but it's very telling that the Holocaust only takes place on zones where the state has been destroyed, and it starts in the zone, the very precise zone, where the state was destroyed twice. There and nowhere else. There and nowhere else. If we turn the description around and ask, where can Jews survive? The answer is where they have citizenship. If you have citizenship in a country that the Germans recognize as a state, they will not kill you. If you're a British or an American Jew and you find yourself in Berlin, you're not going to be killed. You're a citizen of Great Britain. They will only, if you're a citizen of Romania, which carries out its own policy of the mass murder of Jews and kills about 300,000 of them. But if it's in a month where, after mid-42, after October 42, if the Romanians are again recognizing Jews as their own citizens, which they do after the fall of 42, and you are a Romanian Jew who lived in France and you got sent to Drancy, which is the transit camp for Auschwitz from France, if you're there, the Germans will not take you and kill you. They will not take you because the Romanian government has currently recognized you as a Romanian citizen, right? Or look at other examples that are familiar. Bulgaria. There's a nice story about how the Bulgarians saved their Jews, which is, I mean, there's many qualifications one has to offer, but the most important is that Bulgarian Jews who were citizens of Bulgaria before the war generally did survive. Although they were kicked out of the capital and other things happened to them, they generally did survive. But in the territory which Bulgaria gained as a result of the Second World War, there they took all the Jews and sent them to Auschwitz. And we have the telegram from Eichmann where he writes to the Bulgarian government and says, you haven't given them citizenship, have you? And the response back is, no, we haven't given them citizenship. Okay, then please, right? Please deport. So the connection is very clear. I'll give you one more dramatic example, which is Denmark. Denmark also has a nice story about how the Danes saved the Jews, and of course that story is true, although again there are some questions to be asked here. When Werner Best says that the Jewish question has been resolved by all the Danish Jews going to Sweden, it wasn't only Germans who saw it that way, let's put it that way. But the thing about Denmark that I want to flag here is that the Jews who they saved were Danish Jews who had Danish citizenship. If you were just a Jew, but you didn't have Danish citizenship, they didn't save you, they sent you back to Germany. Every single one from 1934 they sent back to Germany, right? And, or to put it a different way, when the Danes looked after their Jews, even when those Jews were in German camps, it was a question of citizenship. But the point I wanted to make, though, was to compare Denmark to Estonia. In Denmark, 99% of the citizens, not the Jews, right, but the citizens who are Jews survive. In Estonia, about 99% are killed, which is a radical difference to have to explain. And what I want to suggest is that the conventional things that we would fall back on, like the nation, simply cannot do the work here. There's no reason to think that the Estonian nation or the Danish nation up until 1939 had any particularly different attitude towards Jews. There's no particular reason, for example, to think that Danes were less anti-Semitic than Estonians were. If anything, it's on the contrary. So if we're going to explain a radical variation 99% to 1%, we need another factor. And for me, that factor is that Denmark experienced the gentlest of the Nazi occupations. And Estonia experienced the most drastic possible combination, which is a complete destruction by the Soviet state, destruction of the entire political apparatus, murder and deportation of essentially the entire political class, criminalization of taking part in the Estonian state at any point after Estonian independence, and so on and so forth, deportation of a serious part of the population, and then a German occupation regime, which was based in rooting up the Soviet occupation apparatus in essentially parallel form. Or, okay, I'll give you one more example, then I promise I stop. The Polish Jews in France. In the Holocaust in France, more Polish Jews died than French Jews. Not in relative terms, in absolute terms. Polish anti-Semitism was a real thing in the world, and still is. But you can't explain why more Polish Jews and French Jews die in France with Polish anti-Semitism. The explanation is that those Polish Jews did not have a state. And the interesting thing is, they understood this at the time as their problem. When the Polish state was destroyed in 1930, after September 1st, what did Polish Jews living in Paris do? They immediately went to the Soviet consulate to try to get papers, right? Because they had a sense. I mean, the saying among Poles and Jews in the Second World War was, passport is what keeps body and soul together. They had an intuition about this, which we've lost. They immediately went to the Soviet consulate to try to get papers, not because they loved the Soviet Union, but because they wanted to have papers, and they very often got them. But then, of course, when Germany invades the Soviet Union in 1941, those papers no longer count, because now Germany doesn't recognize the Soviet Union as a state. So those Polish Jews in Paris don't have papers, and it's very easy. So when they're drawn up and taken to Drancy, they're all sent, and they all die. Okay, which leads me to the end of the story about Irena, and then I should leave some time for questions. So Irena Lipschitz, she puts out her hand, she asks for help, and miraculously, the man walking down the path who meets her eye, and without batting an eye, that's her phrase, agrees to help. He helps her. And as Irena spends a few months with this man, she learns some things about him. She learns that he's a bootlegger, that he's a smuggler, and that he's a kind of anarchist. Under Poland, he had hidden communists because the Communist Party was banned in Poland. Under Soviet rule, he had hidden Poles because so many Poles, especially educated Poles in the political apparatus, were deported to the Gulag under Soviet rule. And then when the Germans came, he had helped Jews. And for him, from his point of view, it was all the same thing. That was his particular political philosophy. So Irena records all of this. I have a friend who's a philosopher at Alabama who reads my books, and he generally just generally corrects the English. But in this particular case, on the margin, when I got to the description of this bootlegger, he wrote, "I want to party with this guy." Which is the feeling I think that the description elicits in all of us, like what a good person, what an interesting person. Wouldn't we be like that in that situation? But the point of this lecture is that there's a reason why people like that are exceptional. In general, the ecological consideration or the consideration of the destruction of normal political order meant that people did not behave like that. It was the very exceptional person who, despite changes in what I'm calling ecology, or despite the void that replaced politics, behaved like that. Which is why, this really will be my last remark, which is why when I think about rescue, I think that it's very important for us, I'm now moving from history into politics and ethics a little bit, but you'll follow me, that it's very important when we think about rescue not to adopt the Hollywood scenario of the one good person who at the end saves the day. Because by the time you get to the end, it's already too late, right? By the time this man is helping Irena, many Jews have already been killed, but also because in general, one person can't save the day. What the lesson, I think, of the causes of the Holocaust, I mean, of course it's the case, as all the Holocaust museums say, and I help them say it when we talk about it, of course it's true that the individual attitude of the individual person matters an awful lot at crucial moments. I would dare say at moments like the ones we're in now. But you get past those moments into places where there are much larger forces at stake, these ecological or these anti-political forces, which seems to me that when we think about rescue or the political consequences of rescue, the political meaning of rescue, the political meaning of rescue would involve trying to prevent us getting into situations that are comparable to this in the first place. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.